There are moments when an empire wins without firing a single shot, simply by proving, in front of the whole world, that distance, silence, and the darkness of the ocean do not mean safety. At the height of the Cold War, when Moscow and Washington measured power in warheads, satellites, and paranoia, the Soviet Union had one comforting certainty. If a secret sank 5,000 meters down, it was buried forever, beyond any human hand. The problem was, the United States wasn't only good at weapons, they were good at making the impossible look routine. And when a Soviet submarine vanished in the Pacific, the CIA didn't think, "It's over." The CIA thought, "It's ours now." In 1968, a Soviet ballistic missile submarine left its base and slipped into the Pacific like it had done before, quietly, methodically, built to exist outside the world. These boats were designed for one thing: vanish. No radar, no witnesses, no second chances. But this time, after it disappeared into the ocean, it disappeared for real. The plan wasn't complicated. Patrol, maintain strict radio discipline, surface only when scheduled, transmit when ordered, then return. The first comms window came and went. Nothing. Command assumed a delay, interference, a tactical choice by the captain. It happens. Submarines don't talk unless they have to. But then the second window passed, and the third. And suddenly, the silence stopped being procedure and became an alarm. Because a submarine like this doesn't simply go missing, it takes nuclear capability with it: warheads, codes, technology, patrol routes, operating methods. And it drags a question to the surface that poisons everything in the Cold War. Was it an accident? Or did someone find it? When you lose a nuclear platform in the ocean, you don't just lose a ship. You lose control. The Soviet response was immediate and massive because there was no other option. Warships and aircraft flooded into the northern Pacific in a search that looked less like routine and more like panic. Sonar runs, grid patterns, triangulations, constant rechecks of anything that could be a clue: a collision, flooding, fire, an explosion, a sudden loss of buoyancy. But the ocean gave them nothing back. No debris on the surface, no oil slick, no clear signal. And with every day that passed, the reality got worse. The search area was enormous, the depth was brutal, and the odds of finding anything dropped fast. Weeks turned into months. The operation grew, burned resources, climbed the chain of command. Still, nothing. Until the most humiliating moment arrived. The Soviet Union had to accept, publicly, what it couldn't face privately. They called off the search. They listed the submarine as lost. They presumed the crew dead. And they tried to let the ocean swallow the whole story. But that kind of ending only feels final, until someone proves it isn't. On the other side of the world, the silence wasn't silence, it was data. While the Soviets swept the Pacific with ships and aircraft, people in the United States didn't have to search the traditional way, because they weren't watching the surface. They were listening to the ocean. And in the Cold War, the sea wasn't just a place, it was a sensor. Since the 1950s, the Americans had been building a network of hydrophones, underwater microphones, positioned at strategic points across the ocean floor. The logic was simple and ruthless. Underwater, sound travels far. Very far. A submarine doesn't need to be seen to be tracked. It only needs to exist loudly enough to leave a trace. Propellers, engines, hull vibration, even the way a boat moved through water. Each class of submarine produced its own acoustic fingerprint, its own pattern in the noise. So when a Soviet submarine vanished, the most important question wasn't, "Where is it?" It was, "What happened to it?" Because the answer might already be captured in something Moscow couldn't control. One short, unnatural event buried inside hours of recordings. Not a message, not a radio call, a sound. Analysts pulled the data from the critical window. Endless tapes, endless plots. To most people, it would have sounded like nothing. Steady hiss, low rumbles, distant interference, the ocean breathing. But then there was a moment that didn't match anything natural. Not an earthquake, not a volcanic tremor, not a missile test. Something sharper, something final, an explosion, a catastrophic collapse. And once they triangulated that signal between listening stations, the map began to tighten. The search went from the entire Pacific to a specific region, still vast, but suddenly possible. In that instant, the Cold War changed shape. Because it's one thing for your enemy to lose a submarine. It's another thing to realize you might know where it is, before they do. And down there, in the cold and crushing dark, could be the most valuable prize the ocean had ever swallowed. Nuclear missile technology, encrypted systems, procedures, hardware. A sealed vault of Soviet secrets, preserved by pressure and silence. At that point, the thought wasn't, the submarine is gone. The thought was, if the ocean kept it, someone could go take it. On the other side of the world, the silence wasn't silence. It was evidence. While Soviet commanders flooded the Pacific with ships and aircraft, the Americans didn't need to search the ocean the old way, because they weren't staring at the surface. They were listening to the deep. And in the Cold War, the sea wasn't just water. It was a surveillance medium. For years, the United States had been laying down a hidden advantage. Underwater listening stations, hydrophones, placed on the ocean floor in strategic corridors. Quiet, patient, and invisible. The logic was brutal. Sound travels far underwater. Extremely far. A submarine can disappear from radar, vanish from satellites, and still betray itself through vibration, machinery, propellers, through the physics of its own existence. Every class of submarine had a signature, a pattern in the noise, a fingerprint pressed into the ocean's background hum. So, when a Soviet submarine stopped talking, the real question for the Americans wasn't, where did it go? It was, what sound did it leave behind? Analysts pulled recordings from the critical window. Hours of dull hiss, low rumbles, distant interference. To most people, it would have sounded like nothing, like the ocean breathing. But buried inside that noise, there was a moment that didn't belong. Not an earthquake, not a volcanic tremor, not a routine naval sound. Something sharp, sudden, final. A violent acoustic event, consistent with an explosion or a catastrophic failure. A signature that said one thing clearly. Something had ended down there, and once they triangulated it, comparing the timing across multiple listening stations, the map began to tighten. What had been an impossible problem shrank into a definable region, still enormous, still deep. But now it was no longer a mystery. It was a target. And that's the moment the story turns. Because it's one thing for the Soviets to lose a nuclear submarine. It's another thing for their enemy to know where it is, before they do. Down on the seabed, in cold darkness and crushing pressure, sat a prize that made the risk feel worth it. Missile technology, cryptographic systems, procedures, hardware, an intact vault of Soviet secrets, sealed by the ocean. At that point, the Americans weren't thinking, the submarine is gone. They were thinking, the ocean is holding it, and we might be able to take it. Finding it wasn't winning. It was just the beginning of the impossible part. Because a dot on a map doesn't put steel in your hands. Down there, 5 kilometers below the surface, was a Soviet ballistic missile submarine. Not a crate, not a wreck you could tow. A full military machine built to carry nuclear weapons, sitting in a place the human body cannot survive for even a second. Pressure that crushes, darkness that never ends, cold that preserves and corrodes, and an ocean that doesn't care how badly you want something. At first glance, the opportunity looked like a jackpot. Missiles, code books, encryption gear, technical manuals, warhead components, anything that could explain how Soviet deterrence really worked. But the reality was brutal. Nobody had ever lifted something like that from that depth. Not even close. The deepest heavy recovery records at the time were measured in tens of tons. This wasn't tens of tons. This was 1,000+ tons of submarine. Dead weight, waterlogged, fragile from impact, and possibly broken into multiple sections. And that depth mattered more than anything. 5 kilometers of water doesn't just hide an object, it protects it, like armor. Every tool you send down becomes a gamble. Every cable becomes a liability. Every mechanical connection becomes a question. Will it hold, or will it snap and vanish into the abyss? Even if you could reach it, you still had to answer the next question. How do you grab it? A submarine doesn't have convenient lifting points. It's not designed to be recovered. It's designed to never be touched by anyone who isn't wearing the same flag. If you clamp too hard, you crush sections. If you clamp too light, you lose it. If the hull is damaged, you might tear it apart. And if it breaks while you're lifting, you don't just fail, you scatter priceless intelligence across the seabed like confetti. And then there was the part nobody could ignore. This wasn't a salvage job. It wasn't rescue. It wasn't recovery. It was theft. A foreign nuclear submarine was still Soviet property. Even if they'd stopped searching. Even if they'd publicly moved on. If the USSR caught the United States hauling it up, they could treat it as a direct act of aggression. Maybe even an act of war. So the mission had to do 2 things at once. Solve a problem engineering said was impossible. Do it without the world realizing what was happening. Because the moment Moscow understood the truth, the ocean wouldn't be the most dangerous thing out there. American military leaders argued against it. Too expensive. Too risky. Too complex. Too easy to trigger a crisis no one could control. But others saw the opposite. The Soviets had dropped a vault of secrets into the deepest safe in the world. And the United States had a rare chance to crack it open. And once that idea took hold, it wasn't a question of should we. It became, how far are we willing to go to pull it off? That's when the operation stopped being a search story and became a construction story. Because to steal something from the bottom of the Pacific, you don't start with ships. You start by inventing a ship that doesn't exist yet. This mission couldn't just be secret. It had to look like something else. Because a ship capable of working 5 kilometers down doesn't slip quietly into the ocean. A project that massive creates noise, paper trails, suppliers, port activity, logistics. People ask questions, journalists ask questions, intelligence services ask questions, and sooner or later, Moscow asks questions. So the CIA didn't try to hide a giant ship. They did something smarter. They built a cover story so believable, so loudly real-world plausible, that the truth would sound insane. And that's where the billionaire came in. In the late 60s and early 70s, the public already understood a certain kind of character. The eccentric tycoon who could bankroll impossible projects simply because he could. And no one fit that role better than Howard Hughes. Hughes was famous, wildly wealthy, and surrounded by a permanent aura of mystery. Aviation, Hollywood, bizarre ventures, paranoia, isolation. So, if headlines said, Howard Hughes is building a massive ship to mine the ocean floor. People wouldn't think CIA operation. They'd think, of course he is. That's Howard Hughes. That was the genius of the disguise. His reputation made the lie feel natural. But the real trick wasn't just the name, it was the structure behind it. The CIA couldn't be seen funding this. If the U.S. government's fingerprints were on that ship, the Soviets would do the math in seconds. So they built layers, clean layers. Money flowed in ways that didn't point back to Washington. The project sat under Hughes-linked corporate entities. Those entities signed perfectly legal contracts with real engineering firms and real suppliers. On paper, everything had a commercial purpose: deep-sea mining. Meaning if someone investigated, what they'd find looked legitimate. Private company, real contracts, industrial logic, technical justification. And the CIA got what it truly needed: a public reason to build an impossible ship and park it in the middle of the Pacific for weeks. We're mining manganese nodules. We're testing deep ocean extraction. It's a billionaire's industrial gamble. A lie so well-dressed it became armor. And the best part? If someone whispered the truth, they're building this to steal a Soviet submarine, it would sound like a conspiracy theory from a back-alley bar. Because the official story came with the perfect face: an eccentric billionaire doing eccentric billionaire things. The CIA didn't just need a plan. It needed a lie, big enough to swallow the truth. Because if anyone realized what was happening out there in the middle of the Pacific, it wouldn't be a scandal. It would be an international incident. And maybe a war. So the real question wasn't, how do we lift a submarine? The real question was, how do we lift a submarine without anyone realizing we're lifting a submarine? That's when they found the perfect cover: deep-sea mining. Back then, it sounded like the future. People talked about it like the next industrial frontier. A strange idea, but not too strange. On the ocean floor were these things called manganese nodules, metal-rich rocks scattered across the seabed like a hidden vault. And the story practically wrote itself. We're building a massive ship to work in deep water, to harvest minerals from the ocean floor. Perfect. Because that cover explained everything. Why the ship had to be enormous. Why it had to sit in one patch of open ocean for weeks. Why it needed gigantic lifting systems and miles of pipe. Why the operation would look slow, repetitive, industrial, in the middle of nowhere. And most importantly, it explained the money. Because this wasn't the U.S. government. This wasn't the CIA. This was a billionaire. A name you could imagine doing anything simply because he could. So the operation becomes a private project, funded by an eccentric magnate, built to mine the deep sea. And the truth stays buried exactly where it needs to be, inside paperwork. Because the CIA didn't sell this cover with a single press line. They built an entire world around it: contracts, subcontractors, suppliers, technical reports, real workers doing real jobs, many of them believing this was purely commercial. The cover had to survive the most dangerous attention of all: Soviet attention. Because, in the Cold War, the Soviets didn't need proof. They only needed suspicion. If they saw a colossal American ship holding position at a specific point in the Pacific, the first question would be obvious: why are they there? And the answer, clean, boring, ready, was mining. Technical, bureaucratic, dull. The kind of explanation that kills curiosity. And that was the point. The genius of the disguise wasn't invisibility. It was normality. Not normal in scale. The ship was huge. Normal in purpose. Industry. Exploration. Extraction. And the longer the Soviets watched, the more routine it looked. Equipment going down, equipment coming up, movements on deck, slow mechanical work. It looked like men trying to pull rock from the sea floor. Except down there, it wasn't rock. It was Soviet steel. It was classified hardware. It was a submarine, armed, secret, and dead silent, lying in the black water like an impossible corpse. And while the world saw a daring commercial project, the CIA saw what it really was: the perfect cover for a theft that couldn't look like theft. Because once the ship reaches the target area and the real work begins, anyone watching from a distance wouldn't see a crime. They'd only see a giant industrial experiment, a billionaire burning money, a ship chasing the future. They had the cover story. They had the target. They had the money. Now, they needed something nobody had ever built. Because this wasn't a recovery mission. This was engineering at the edge of reality. The submarine sat nearly 5 kilometers down. Not deep. Not very deep. Crushing, black, pressure of a mountain deep. And the object they wanted to lift wasn't a crate. It wasn't a tank. It was a broken steel giant, weighing over 1,000 tons, resting in silence on the ocean floor. So the CIA approved the only plan that could work. Build a ship so large, so specialized, so strange. It would look like science fiction, even to people building it. This ship would later be known as the Hughes Glomar Explorer. On paper, it was a deep-sea mining vessel, a floating factory designed to lower a mining system into the abyss and bring manganese nodules back to the surface. In reality, it was a machine built for one purpose: to steal a submarine. And the design wasn't just ambitious, it was surgical, because the mission required something no normal ship needed: a way to lift the submarine and hide it, without ever letting it be seen. That's where the Explorer's most bizarre feature came in: a massive opening in the middle of the ship. A hidden internal bay called a moon pool. Imagine a ship with a secret mouth in its belly. Gigantic doors underneath that could open to the ocean, lower equipment straight down, and pull something up. Inside the ship itself. No cranes hoisting a prize in full view. No silhouette of a submarine breaking the surface for cameras to catch. If the operation succeeded, the world would never see the moment it happened. The submarine would rise and disappear into the ship like it was being swallowed. Then came the lifting system. The crew couldn't simply lower a cable and hook the wreck. At that depth, steel cable becomes a liability, too heavy, too unstable, too unpredictable. Instead, the Explorer used a system that looked like industrial madness. A long chain of pipe sections, thick, heavy, rigid, connected one by one, lowered into the ocean like a spine. Each segment added weight, each segment added risk, and each segment had to be handled with precision, because if anything failed, the whole system could buckle, snap, or collapse into the sea. Down at the bottom, at the end of that mechanical spine, was the real secret. A massive capture device. A steel claw large enough to grip part of the submarine's hull. Not a delicate tool. A brutal, industrial hand designed to grab Soviet steel in the dark. But building the hardware was only half the nightmare. The ocean doesn't hold still. Waves, swells, currents. The ship rises and falls constantly, even on a calm day. At 5 kilometers deep, even small motion becomes amplified. A tiny shift at the surface becomes a dangerous lateral force on the system below. So they gave the Explorer another capability that felt impossible for its time: dynamic positioning. A system that used sensors, computers, and thrusters to keep the ship locked in place over a single point in the ocean, holding position with eerie precision. It's common now. Back then, It was revolutionary. The ship wasn't just floating. It was actively fighting the sea. And as construction moved forward, the scale became absurd. This wasn't a vessel. It was a moving facility. A ship that could carry thousands of tons of equipment. A ship with internal machinery the public would never fully understand. A ship built with one secret hidden inside another secret. And through all of it, the CIA treated secrecy like oxygen. Not, please don't tell. Compartmentalization. Workers knew their piece. Engineers knew their subsystem. Sailors were hired for a job they were told was mining. Even the paperwork was designed to confuse. If someone asked, "What is this ship really for?" they'd drown in contracts, shell companies, and technical jargon before they ever found an answer. Because the Explorer wasn't just being built in steel. It was being built in layers. Layers of deception. Layers of bureaucracy. Layers of plausible deniability. And that mattered, because the CIA wasn't just racing the ocean. It was racing time. Every month that passed meant more risk of exposure, more Soviet curiosity, more chances the wreck would degrade, shift, or become unreachable. But by the early 1970s, the impossible ship began to look real. A gigantic deep-sea mining vessel ready to sail to an empty patch of ocean and perform a task the world believed couldn't be done. And once it left port, the Cold War would move from missiles and spies to something quieter. A theft conducted in open water, in plain sight, disguised as a business venture. Because soon, the Explorer would arrive above the wreck, and the CIA would attempt the most audacious recovery operation in its history. Out there in the Pacific, the CIA wasn't hunting a submarine the way people imagine it. There was no dramatic sonar ping echoing through a war room. No captain shouting, "There! Mark it!" Because at 5 kilometers deep, the ocean isn't a place you search. It's a place you guess. And then prove you were right. By mid-1968, the Americans had something the Soviets didn't. A clue that didn't come from ships or planes. It came from sound. A network of underwater listening stations had captured something unusual, an event that didn't match storms, earthquakes, or normal naval traffic. It sounded like a violent mechanical failure, an explosion, a sudden end. Not proof, but a fingerprint. A narrow patch of ocean where K-129 could be. And that was enough to launch the next step. The part of the story that feels like espionage turning into science fiction. A U.S. submarine named USS Halibut was sent toward the coordinates, quietly, carefully, and under a cover that made it look like research. On paper, it was an oceanographic mission. In reality, it was an underwater burglary in slow motion. Halibut had been rebuilt for one job: deep-sea intelligence work. Cameras, sonar, specialized equipment designed to operate where sunlight never reaches. And here's the part that makes this operation terrifying. The people running it weren't looking at a clear target. They were trying to find a wreck in a wilderness of rock and sand. By moving slowly above the seabed and taking thousands upon thousands of photographs. Frame after frame. Nothing. More frames. Nothing. And then, something. A hard line where there shouldn't be one. A shape too straight to be geology. A shadow too deliberate to be natural. They didn't see it the first time. They couldn't. Down there, everything looks wrong. So they kept going. Kept shooting, and eventually the ocean floor gave it up. A Soviet submarine, broken, resting in pieces, but unmistakable. K-129. The discovery didn't arrive like a Hollywood reveal. It arrived like a cold realization, because in that moment, the mission changed. Before, It was, can we find it? Now it became, we found it. Now what? And that's where the secrecy deepened. Most of the crew still didn't fully understand what they were doing. They were given narrow tasks: operate equipment, process film, report anomalies, without being told the real prize they were chasing. Even the photography specialists weren't necessarily briefed with the full truth. They didn't need the full truth. They just needed to keep the machine running. Because the real intelligence wasn't only the wreck itself. It was the fact that these photos could prove what the Soviets had failed to admit, that a nuclear-armed submarine was missing, and the USSR couldn't even find its own grave. When Halibut returned, the evidence didn't get filed into some normal archive. It moved like contraband. A small set of images, grainy, black and white, brutal in what they implied, was handled with extreme care and pushed up the chain fast. Because photographs of K-129 on the seabed weren't just reconnaissance. They were a green light. They were the moment the CIA could look at the impossible and say, it's real, it's there, and it can be taken. But here's the twist. Finding the wreck wasn't the end of the story. It was the moment the story became dangerous. Because the ocean had revealed the submarine, and now the Americans had to answer the hardest question of the Cold War. How do you steal something that weighs 1,500 tons from 5 kilometers underwater without starting a war? Those photographs from the bottom of the Pacific changed everything and created a new kind of danger, because now the CIA had something worse than a mystery. It had certainty. K-129 was down there. And if it was down there, it wasn't a lost Soviet secret. It was a secret waiting to be taken. But the ocean has its own rule. It doesn't negotiate. It only collects. And the price of trying to lift that submarine was so insane that even after years of planning, when the ship finally reached the exact coordinates, nobody relaxed. They got quieter. Because out there, surrounded by nothing but water and sky, the operation stopped being an idea and became a real, physical thing that could break. The Hughes Glomar Explorer had to do something that sounds simple in one sentence, but borders on impossible in reality: hold still in the open ocean as if it were anchored to solid ground. Not mostly still. Not still for a minute. Still enough to lower a massive retrieval system straight down 5 kilometers into black water, because beneath the hull was the target. And to reach it, the crew had to build a steel column into the sea, section by section, like assembling a skyscraper upside down. That's what people miss about this part. The submarine wasn't lifted by some magic switch. It was reached through a brutal, methodical process. Lower a section, lock it, check alignment. Add the next section, lower again. Lock again, repeat. For hours. For days. The clanging of metal, the slow rhythm of machinery, the constant inspections. It became the heartbeat of the ship. And the deeper the system went, the higher the tension climbed. Because now every connection mattered. If one joint failed, it wasn't try again tomorrow. It was lose the entire system, and possibly the whole mission, in the deepest part of the ocean. Meanwhile, the sea never stopped moving. Currents pulled, waves nudged, wind shifted, and the Glomar Explorer had to fight all of it, correcting its position constantly, quietly, precisely. Because the column hanging beneath it could not be allowed to swing. Then came the detail that turns this into pure Cold War suspense. They weren't alone. A Soviet ship appeared in the area. Not a fleet. Not an attack. Worse than that, a quiet presence, close enough to watch, close enough to raise questions. It circled. It lingered. It came back. And suddenly, the operation had two threats at once. One, down below, the system was descending toward K129, a needle-threading act in total darkness. Two, up above, the Americans had to keep looking like exactly what their cover story claimed: a civilian vessel doing deep-sea mining. Because if the Soviets pushed closer, if they demanded inspection, if they tried to board, if they forced contact, the entire mission could flip from secret operation to international incident in a heartbeat. So the crew worked in a strange double reality. Inside the ship, everything was tense, technical, fragile. Outside the ship, everything had to look ordinary. And time wasn't on their side. The ocean had a window. Weather could turn. Waves could rise. And if the sea shut the door, you didn't argue. You waited a year, or you never came back. Finally, after days of lowering and locking and checking, the last sections approached the bottom, and the mission crossed a line. Because now they weren't deploying equipment. Now they were about to do the thing the world wasn't supposed to be able to do: grab a Soviet nuclear missile submarine in the dark. No human hands, no clear visibility. Only instruments, sensors, calculations, and engineering built for a job that had never existed before. When the mechanism finally found metal, when the system touched the wreck, there wasn't celebration. There was silence. Because holding it was only half the battle. Now came the part that separates a brilliant plan from a historic humiliation: bringing it up, centimeter by centimeter, without slipping, without breaking, without exposing what they were doing, and above all, without the ocean reminding them, at the worst possible moment, that 5 kilometers down, there is no margin for error. The Glomar Explorer didn't rush straight to the target. It sailed like a normal commercial ship: plausible route, controlled communications, routine on the surface. No dramatic moves, no behavior that looked military. Because in that mission, arriving was only half the problem. The destination was a single point in the Pacific. No coastline, no landmarks, no visual reference. Just ocean, just sky, just emptiness. And in that emptiness, the real operation began. When the Explorer finally reached the area, nobody celebrated. The mood wasn't, "We made it." The mood was, "Now we can't make a single mistake." Because what came next depended on something that sounds simple and is almost impossible at sea: holding perfectly still. Not still like a parked car. Still enough that the ship could remain aligned over one precise spot for days. Out on the open ocean, a ship is never truly stationary. Currents push. Waves shift the hull. Wind rotates the vessel. That would normally be just uncomfortable. Except the Explorer was about to do something that didn't tolerate drift. From that moment on, position wasn't a detail. It was the entire project. Far below, on the ocean floor, there was a specific target. And the system descending from the ship had to reach the right place, not close enough. If the ship slid even a few meters, what was going down could lose alignment, twist under load, jam, or worse, break. And breaking down there meant two disasters at once: losing critical equipment and creating the kind of incident that could attract attention fast. So the Explorer used its quiet advantage: dynamic positioning. No anchors. The water was far too deep. Instead, the ship relied on thrusters and control systems constantly correcting against the sea, minute by minute, hour by hour, countering every push of wind and current. It was like balancing on a wire, continuously, without rest. And if it failed, the entire mission failed with it. Once the ship was locked over the point, the slowest and most nerve-wracking stage began: the descent. This wasn't press a button and lower a crane. It was a staged, methodical process. The system was massive, heavy, and complex, and each section had to be connected, verified, aligned, before the next one could go down. It worked like this: connect a section, confirm readings, check stability, verify alignment, lower it, repeat. That took time, a lot of time. And time was the enemy for three reasons. First, the calm sea window was short. If conditions worsened, the risk climbed fast. Second, days of continuous movement and tension meant wear, adjustment, potential failure. A small technical issue could turn into a catastrophic one. And third, worst of all, the longer the explorers stayed in that area, the more likely it became that someone would notice. And someone did. A Soviet ship appeared on the horizon. Not a destroyer, not a cruiser. Something smaller. Something that could plausibly be out there without screaming war. And that was exactly why it was dangerous. A small ship can observe without looking aggressive. It can circle, it can drift closer, it can get curious. And curiosity was deadly for the explorer. Inside the American ship, the tension shifted instantly. What had been an engineering operation became a psychological one. Keep calm, keep routine, keep the cover story alive. The crew knew what could happen if the Soviets decided to push their luck. It wouldn't take gunfire, just an insistent approach, a demand to inspect, a boarding attempt. And the Americans had a recent nightmare that shaped their thinking. The Pueblo incident, when a U.S. vessel with sensitive intelligence equipment was captured, taking secrets and humiliation with it. The explorer couldn't repeat that. So procedures were ready. If the situation escalated, there were plans to eliminate sensitive material fast. Documents, logs, evidence, everything designed to disappear before anyone could see it. Meanwhile, outside, the Soviet ship stayed nearby, circling, watching, close enough to remind everyone of something simple. The Cold War didn't always look like war. Sometimes it looked like a ship on the horizon. And at that moment, with the recovery system descending slowly toward the ocean floor, the explorer was doing something it couldn't explain and couldn't stop. They had to keep going, and they had to hope the Soviet ship would remain only an observer and not decide to come any closer. The Soviet ship didn't attack. It didn't transmit threats. It didn't raise flags. It just stayed there, close enough to be felt. And that was the worst kind of pressure, because the Glomar explorer couldn't leave. It couldn't speed up. It couldn't even change its behavior without risking suspicion. So on deck, the ship looked calm, routine, normal, commercial. But inside, everyone knew the truth. This was the phase where the mission could collapse from a single failure. The recovery system was already descending, and the deeper it went, the less room there was for improvisation. At the surface, if something jams, you stop, you fix it. At 5 kilometers down, you don't fix it. You guess, you calculate, you wait. Sometimes for hours, and you hope you're right. The crew wasn't just lowering equipment. They were managing a chain of fragile steps where every section depended on the last, and every step had a limit. Not a dramatic limit, a quiet limit. Time, weather, fatigue, and the fact that a Soviet ship was sitting there, watching them mine. The ship continued to circle. Each day it stayed. The tension became heavier. Because the Soviet crew didn't need to fire a shot to ruin everything, they only needed to get curious enough to come closer, and closer, and closer. On the Explorer, the response was discipline. No strange movements, no sudden course changes, no obvious panic. The mining story had to remain believable. So the deck stayed active, cranes moving, routine tasks, paperwork visible, equipment handled like a normal industrial job. From the outside, it looked like a company doing deep-sea work. From the inside, it felt like a heist happening in slow motion. Then the recovery system reached the bottom. No cheering, no dramatic moment. Just a shift in the room, like everyone held their breath at once. Because now, the mission wasn't descending anymore. Now, it was hunting. Somewhere below, the K-129 was lying in darkness, broken but recognizable. The recovery device, this huge mechanical claw, had to line up with the wreck. And that was harder than it sounds. You can't see clearly at that depth, not like in movies. You rely on cameras, sonar, and imperfect signals. You interpret shadows and shapes. You make decisions with partial information, and every decision costs time. Then came the moment the whole project had been built for. The claw closed. And for the first time, the explorer wasn't just hovering over the target. It had it. But holding it was one thing. Raising it was another. That lift was slow, painfully slow, because the load wasn't just heavy. It was delicate in the worst possible way. This wasn't a clean steel block. It was a damaged submarine section, stressed, cracked, weakened by the initial disaster and years under crushing pressure. Pull too hard, too fast, or at the wrong angle, and it could break apart. And if it broke apart, the most valuable parts could fall back into the deep. For a while, the lift worked. Progress was steady. Readings looked stable. Then, suddenly, something changed. The engineers saw it first, not with their eyes, but in the numbers. The load didn't feel right. Not a dramatic failure, not a violent jolt, just an ugly, quiet sign. They were losing weight. And in that business, losing weight meant one thing. Something had broken. Part of the wreck had slipped free, dropped back down. 5 kilometers. Gone. Inside the ship, the atmosphere turned cold. This was the nightmare scenario they had tried not to say out loud for years. If they lost too much, the mission would still be successful on paper. But it would be a strategic disaster. Because the goal wasn't just to prove they could lift something. The goal was what was inside the submarine. Nuclear technology, cryptographic systems, secret mechanisms, anything that could reveal how the Soviet force actually worked. And now, part of the prize was back on the ocean floor. But the claw still held something. They still had a section. The mission wasn't dead. Not yet. Then the Soviet ship moved. It came closer. A slow approach, not rushed. Like a person stepping toward a locked door just to see if it's really locked. On the Explorer, people watched the distance close. The ship got near enough that binoculars weren't needed anymore. Near enough that crews could see each other clearly. And now everyone understood the real fear. If the Soviets boarded, they could end the operation instantly. They could seize evidence. They could turn a secret CIA theft into an international crisis. The Explorer sounded a warning horn. The Soviet ship kept coming. For a moment, it felt like history was about to tilt. Then, something surreal happened. The Soviet sailors, lined along the rail, turned their backs, dropped their pants, and mooned the Americans. It wasn't diplomacy. It wasn't an inspection. It was mockery. A loud, childish message. In the middle of the Cold War. We see you. We're not impressed. And we're leaving. Laughter broke out on the Explorer, half relief, half disbelief. And then the Soviet ship finally turned away and headed off. But the relief didn't last. Because the Americans still had to finish the lift. And what they were pulling upward was no longer the full prize. It was whatever survived the break. And that meant the real reveal was coming. What did they actually recover? What did they lose forever? And would the wreck they managed to bring up be enough to justify one of the most expensive, risky intelligence operations ever attempted? That answer was rising toward the surface, meter by meter. And everyone on the Explorer knew the closer it got to daylight, the more dangerous it became. Not because of the Soviets, because of what happens when the deep ocean finally lets go of its secrets. For days, the lift was just tension and numbers, weight readings, cable strain, tiny adjustments that could decide everything. Then the ocean finally gave something back. Slowly, the recovered section rose toward the surface, still hidden under the Glomar Explorer, still protected from prying eyes. And that was the brilliance of the ship. It wasn't built just to lift the submarine, it was built to hide it. Beneath the Explorer was a huge opening, an internal bay, designed so the wreck could be pulled up into the ship's belly, out of sight from any Soviet ship watching the horizon. Inside, the mood didn't turn into celebration. It turned into silence. Because the mission stopped being a concept and became real. Damaged steel, torn compartments, the physical evidence of a disappearance that had haunted 1968. Teams moved fast, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. The deep ocean preserves things, but the moment you bring a wreck into warmer air, with oxygen and handling, deterioration accelerates. What survived for years on the seabed could start falling apart now. And then came the part no one wanted to face. There were remains, not just metal, not just secrets. Human cost, still inside the submarine. The crew had been warned in training, but nothing prepares you for seeing it in real life. They secured what they could. They documented everything. They moved sensitive items into sealed compartments. And then reality hit harder. This wasn't the section everyone wanted. The most valuable part, the area believed to hold the biggest intelligence prizes, was still down on the seabed, lost when the claw failed. So Azorian delivered something extraordinary, but not everything. And that meant the mission had one last priority: leave. Because once the wreck was on board, staying near that location wasn't just risky. It was begging to be exposed. Next, the mission escapes the ocean, only to face something worse than depth: the outside world. The operation had survived the ocean. It had survived engineering problems no one had solved before. It had survived Soviet eyes circling nearby. But there was one enemy Azorian could never out-engineer: people. Because secrecy isn't defeated by storms or steel. It's defeated by a sentence told to the wrong person. Back in Washington, the CIA treated the return like a quiet victory. The ship moved. The cargo was handled. The most sensitive materials were separated, sealed, analyzed, and buried inside layers of classification. And for a moment, it looked like they might get away with it. Then, late in 1974, something small happened, so small it almost seemed meaningless. An envelope appeared at the Soviet embassy in Washington. No signature, no proof, just a message that sounded like insanity: that the Americans had tried to raise a Soviet submarine from the Pacific Ocean. At first, it didn't land like a bomb. Anonymous tips were common. Most were garbage. Some were propaganda. Many were ignored. But this one was oddly specific. And behind closed doors, it forced a question no one wanted to ask: how did anyone even know where to look? Not long after, rumors began leaking through Washington like smoke under a door. Journalists started hearing the same impossible story from different angles. Whispers about a giant ship, deep-sea mining, and a Soviet wreck. Then the press caught the scent. First came a report that was messy. Wrong ocean, wrong submarine, missing details. But even with errors, it confirmed something terrifying. The story was real enough to print. And once one outlet touched it, others followed. Investigations, radio segments, bigger names, more sources. The public didn't get the full truth, but they got the shape of it. A secret ship, a sunken Soviet sub, a recovery attempt. And suddenly, the CIA faced the worst-case scenario. They hadn't just stolen a submarine. They'd created a headline. At that point, the next phase, going back for the rest, became nearly impossible. Because returning to the same coordinates with the same ship wasn't deep-sea mining anymore. It was a confession. And Moscow, publicly silent, didn't need to shout. Silence was enough. Because if the Soviets responded too loudly, they would have to admit what they didn't want the world to know. That they lost a nuclear-armed submarine and couldn't find it. So both sides did what Cold War empires did best. They pretended. The USSR filed diplomatic complaints without naming the truth. The United States denied everything with a straight face, and the CIA answered questions the only way it could. Not with a yes, not with a no, but with the phrase that became famous because of this exact operation: "We can neither confirm nor deny." That sentence wasn't just PR. It was a shield. Because Azorian wasn't just a mission, it was a precedent. A proof that in the Cold War, the battlefield wasn't only land, air, or space. It was the ocean. And the lesson was brutal. The Soviet Union thought 5 kilometers of water meant safety. Azorian proved it meant nothing. Even the deep sea wasn't deep enough to hide from a superpower that decided your secrets belonged to them.